exploring the Psalms. Today, we've just heard, we're looking at Psalm 31. You might have noticed it's a little bit longer than the Psalms we've looked at in the last few weeks in January. So there's a bit to get through, and probably not a song that we can sing on this one, might take too long. And sometimes when we have a psalm like this that's really long, at least I find, it's quite tough to work out what's going on. So the plan today is to try and shed some light on that for us. And I have to say, I don't think I've ever really read this psalm before. I might have come across it. But I think I read it like we heard today, and it's a lot to take in. And my personal experience has been looking into it. It's really a psalm you can love. It's really a psalm that applies to us. So hopefully today you can also get a sense of that psalm. Now, this psalm is also a lament. We heard a little bit last week about the types of psalms of praise, psalms of thanksgiving, and the largest group of psalms, which is these psalms of lament. And as we read it this morning, of course there's so much because of the way it starts and the way it ends. It starts quite strong, ends quite strong. You might have missed lament. It's right there in the middle. So I hope as we look closer to it today and we pull it apart, that lament also will become clear to us all. So for me to tackle this psalm, this large psalm, Psalm 31, I thought the best way to do it would be to maybe put an idea in our minds, a big idea about what this psalm is about, so that we can sort of keep centered as we work through it. And, a big idea for me is just a simple statement that tries to cover the takeaway from the psalm. And I decided after poring over it, the big idea would be something like seeking refuge in the Lord. And you might think, well, you didn't look very far, because that's just sort of repeating the first sentence of the psalm. And that might be true. So let me maybe expand on a little bit further and say the big idea for me is seeking refuge in the faithful Lord in faith. So how do I come to this big idea? Well, for me, it's pretty obvious from the repetition we see around the word refuge within the psalm. I don't know if you picked that up. And also, not only the word refuge, but the concept of refuge that gets repeated over and over as we look through. So if we quickly look now, you'll see, if you flick through your Bible, the word itself, refuge, is mentioned 4 times. Verse 1, verse 2, verse 4, and verse 19. So refuge seems to be a word of significance, I think, apart from connecting words, it's the most repeated word we see in the psalm. And if I look at the common English definition of the word refuge, just so we get a sense of what that means, the Oxford Dictionary tells us it means a state of being safe or sheltered from pursuit, danger, or difficulty. So let me say that again. It means a state of being safe or sheltered from pursuit, danger, or difficulty. So if we come back to our passage and look a little bit more closely, we can see the idea of refuge, as it's just been defined, is expanded and it's fortified, pun intended, by the surrounding thoughts of the psalm. So let's look at a couple of examples of those, and a really good one is just verse 2, where it reads, "Turn your ear to me, come quickly to my rescue, be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me." So here we see the idea of coming to the psalmist's rescue and being his rock of refuge and a strong fortress of salvation. It aligns nicely with the definition from the Oxford Dictionary. Because refuge is not just a place. It's not, we often think of maybe as a place, but it's not just a place that we stay. It's a place which shelters. It keeps you safe, safe from the forces of danger and difficulty we see in that definition. So in that sense, it rescues you from dangers and difficulties. And it needs to be strong, like a rock, to be a fortress, to ward off those difficulties. So the psalmist uses this sort of parallel language of fortress to convey or expand this idea. So to summarise, we don't only see the word refuge repeated through this psalm, but we also see, further expressions of what refuge is. So we see words like rescue, like rock, like strong fortress, like salvation, or actually the word save, which is repeated a few times. And there's some other examples, and I'll quickly run through a couple more, just because they're a little bit different. If we move to verse 8, the psalmist describes the place of refuge as being a spacious place. And that's imagery contrary to what we might expect but equally fits the definition of a state of being safe. But, a spacious place it's not a cramped little refuge. This is a spacious refuge. And another can be seen in verse 20. And verse 20 is like verse 2. It's got in a single verse many examples. So if we read it, in the shelter of your presence, you hide them. From all human intrigues, you keep them safe in your dwelling from accusing tongues. So there we see it's a shelter, it's a hiding place, it's a place of safety, it's in the Lord's own presence, and it's a dwelling place. So hopefully then you get this idea from this quick run through how the concept of refuge is quite a central thought in this psalm. So now we understand refuge is important in the psalm, and we get an idea of the definition of what that means. But what does it mean to the psalmist? What's the psalmist getting at here? Is he just talking about a literal physical shelter, or is he refuge, or is he thinking about something more than that? What's the context? What's the situation? One way to expand our understanding of what the psalmist might mean is to look at other psalms, which might have similar language or similar hints for us about what this might mean. And with that in mind, I did a search of the word refuge in the Psalms, and I find that the word refuge is mentioned 43 times in 30 Psalms. So the vast majority of the use of the word refuge in the Bible actually comes in the Psalms. Actually, it's about double that in the whole Bible. Just for interest, the Old Testament uses, before the Psalms uses it a lot, but it's just talking about cities of refuge. It's like a place. It's not in this sense of what a refuge is. Now, we don't have time to go through 29 other Psalms and look at those 39 other references. So what I wanted to do was to look at one Psalm which I think gives us an excellent picture of what this concept of refuge might be. And that Psalm is Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 is quite helpful here too, because Psalm 2 at the beginning of this sort of anthology of Psalms is there to give us a bit of a guide on the key themes of the Psalms. And one of those themes I think is refuge. So let's turn to Psalm 2 and follow as I read it to you. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one in heaven, enthroned in heaven, laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son, today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron, and you will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss the Son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So what a powerful word of worship to our God at this time in particular, where we're aware of the rulers of the earth taking their stand. And maybe that's all eras and times. But we're aware of the damage and the fear and the anguish that this has and can create. And we're reminded who they ultimately answer to in this psalm. They answer to the all-powerful God of the universe and beyond. And he laughs at their pitiful, feeble displays of might. He can, at his will, destroy them in a moment, but he can also bless those who come to him in refuge. And in this psalm, take note of the single use of the word refuge, right? So it's just one use right there at the end. Yes, it says refuge in the Lord, just as we see in the opening verse of Psalm 31, but we get a much more dramatic picture of what it means. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. Not just saved or sheltered, but blessed. And when we look at the reason they're blessed, as described in this psalm, we see a bigger picture. Unlike Psalm 31, where we do get a sense it's about the psalmist, a single person escaping an enemy or a group of enemies, here we rather see all those who oppose the Lord and his anointed one are warned. So it's more or less everyone, the whole world. They want to serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. And then if you suck up to him and make sure you don't anger him, because if you do, he'll destroy you in his anger. which can flare up like that. And it's with that in mind we're told, blessed are all those who take refuge in him. And please don't miss what this blessing means. This blessing is not protection from the earthly kings and these rulers with their armies. It's not from immediate or physical or local enemies. The blessing is protection from God. It's protection from God's own wrath that can flare up in a moment. The blessing is refuge from the consequences of our own sin and guilt. We hide in the Lord to avoid being the subject of his wrath that we deserve. So the blessing here we see is grace. So refuge in this light is true salvation. It's more than rescue from the concerns of now. It's the undeserved favour of God. And with that in mind, I think we can look back and look inside the mind of the psalmist in Psalm 31, probably the same psalmist. We get a sense of refuge in faith. But you might be thinking, okay, is this Psalm 2 refuge really the refuge of Psalm 31? Well, the best way to see is let's work through the psalm together now again. Now, I think it's helpful to break the psalm up a little bit into sections to sort of bite it off one piece at a time, because it moves around a little bit. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to break it up into some groups of verses, and I've just used how the NIV breaks it up there in the stanzas. But what I'm also going to do is not start at the beginning and read through. I'm going to start in the middle, because in the middle we find what actually the immediate issue is at hand. What's the occasion? Why is he writing this psalm? So in verse 13 we read, "For I hear many whispering, terror on every side. They conspire against me and plot to take my life." So the occasion for this psalm would appear to be the psalmist is in fear of his own life. The specifics of why or who's after him or whatever, they're not explained. But what is explained in the immediately preceding verses 9 to 12, is the impact this threat is having on his life and on his overall well-being. So let's read now from verse 9 as the next section, down to 12. "Be merciful to me, Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. Because of all my enemies, I am the utter contempt of my neighbours, and an object of dread to my closest friends. Those who see me on the street flee from me. I am forgotten as though I were dead. I have become like broken pottery." And this part, of course, is the lament. The psalmist's fear is so great that he can barely function. It's impacting him physically, we read there. It's impacting him mentally. It goes further than that, and it's probably because of how the psalmist is reacting to what's going on. It's impacting his whole social network, his relationships. He's the dread of his closest friends, and those around him now flee from him. Now, the thing about many of the Psalms is the occasion for them we don't often face. We're not like the psalmist. We don't, hopefully now, nor will have someone chasing us to kill us, conspiring against us to plot to take our life. But what we can relate to is the lament, the reaction to that fear. This we can relate to. So we can relate to all those situations which create stress in our lives that impact us physically and mentally and flow over into our closest relationships, whether it's health concerns or whether it's about what's happening at work or the fact that you don't have work, or whether it's how our grades are going at school. Maybe it's a mistake we've made in life. Maybe it's issues we have with our own close friends or family, or it's issues we have with those who aren't our friends. Whatever it is, stresses of life, they can impact us and they consume us, and we can let them do that. They can eat us up from the inside, as we get a sense as the psalmist goes through here. And so that's where the psalmist's situation speaks to us as well. And in light of that situation, this psalm opens up with a prayer. So now let's jump back to the beginning. So now we've set the scene. What's the occasion? What's the lament? How does the psalmist start? Let's read from verse 1. "In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Turn your ear to me. Come quickly to my rescue. Be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me. You are my rock and my fortress. For the sake of your name, lead and guide me. Keep me free from the trap that is set for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God. Now, I've already spent a bit of time on this sort of section, in essence, because it contains a lot of this image about the concept of refuge and rescue and strong fortress. But what I want you to look at in this section is verses 3 and 4, because this is a prayer and it opens as a request. But verse 3 and 4 is not a request, but it's a statement. So in verses 1 and 2, and a little bit in verse 4, the psalmist is asking for refuge. But in verse 3, he says, since you are my rock and my fortress. And in verse 4, the second part, he says, for you are my refuge. So the psalmist, he starts by asking for refuge, yes, but he's also declaring refuge. And it's a little bit, I think what helps us understand this now, you are my refuge and be my refuge, so future, is this last verse, verse 5. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God. He's relying on God who is faithful. Faithful in the past. Faithful now in refuge. Faithful, therefore, he says, into the future. And notice that there's quite a lack in this opening prayer of request. There's quite a lack of the specifics of what we just read about in the lament and the occasion. It's there, of course, there's hints there, but not much substance. And we'll see later on there is substance in his prayer. So in this initial part of the prayer, no substance. He's really coming to God with a request of refuge because of who God is, because he's recognising in his position of frailty that all he can rely on is God. So he's submitting to the Lord in faith because first and foremost the Lord is his faithful God. He's taking refuge in God in the way we saw in Psalm 2. So having opened in prayer, we're going to move on. He started by petitioning God and declaring his faith in the faithful God. The psalmist supports this statement with his own experience. So in verses 6 to 8, directly after this, he goes on not so much in prayer, but as a declaration of his experience of God. And he says, I hate those who cling to worthless idols. As for me, I trust in the Lord. I will be glad and rejoice in your love, for you saw my affliction and you knew the anguish of my soul. You have not given me into the hands of the enemy, but you have set my feet in a spacious place. The psalmist trusts the Lord because the Lord has protected him this far and even more has provided him distance from his enemies. So the psalmist is looking back in a sense and saying, well, I've seen that you've done this before. This is where my faith comes from. So at the beginning he declares his faith in God, and here he tells us why he has this faith. And with that, we've actually covered the first half of the psalm. I don't know if you've realised that. We now have covered 1 to 13, so this first big passage. And just to summarise it, it starts with this prayer for refuge and declaration of refuge. It's followed by this statement of trust because of what he's already experienced. Then we get the lament, and at the very end, 13, we get the reason for the lament. So now let's move to verses 14 and 18. This comes after the lament. So what happens in reflection of the lament? And here we see the psalmist first up, verses 14 to 18, in that next stanza. He builds up on this prayer that he started. But now we get into what's driving his fears. Now it gets a little bit more specific and focused on what's going on. So let's read from verse 14. But I trust in you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands. Deliver me from the hands of my enemies, from those who pursue me. Let your face shine on your servant. Save me in your unfailing love. Let me not be put to shame, Lord, for I cried out to you. But let the wicked be put to shame and be silent in the realm of the dead. Let their lying lips be silent, for with pride and contempt they speak arrogantly against the righteous. So again, we see the psalmist calls in faith, but this time His faith is based firstly on God's sovereignty. If we look in verse 15, my times are in your hands. So he recognises his position is up, what happens is up to God and God's plan. And secondly, he relies on the Lord's love in verse 16. Save me in your unfailing love. So while his prayer is made in trust, there's a sense here that the psalmist isn't taking it for granted that his immediate issues are going to be dealt with in the way that he's requesting. So he's acknowledging God for who he is and his trust and his comfort in refuge in God, but he's also saying, but it's up to you. You're in charge and you love me and you will do what you will do. So it's up to God in the end to do God's will. And you might have missed there that there is an echo. How do I know that this prayer is linked to the prayer from 1 to 5? Because we see a bit of an echo here of the opening verse of verse 1. We see it repeated in here, and I think the psalmist has done that deliberately. So if you look in verse 1, it says, "In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness." So they're the two things that we see repeat in verses 17 and 18. He opens verse 17 with, "Let me not be put to shame, Lord, for I cried out." And he gives detail. So here, as I said, in the first part of his prayer, he makes these statements that's lacking detail. And it seems as in the second part of his prayer, he's expanding the detail. So when he says, "Let me never be put to shame," he expands on that in the nature of his enemies, the wicked, putting him to shame or killing him, shaming him by killing him. And then he reverses and said, "You should, in fact, do it to them." And so in the second part, "Deliver me in your righteousness," we sort of see the counter of that. We see at the bottom of verse 18, they speak arrogantly against the righteous. So we see this link for the first half of the prayer to the second. And a little bit what we see going on here is what Tim spoke about last week, where the psalmist is sort of saying, hey, God, don't shame yourself by letting the enemy shame me. It's more or less what he's saying. So rather shame my enemy. Deal with them, and then that's going to demonstrate glory to you. So that's the psalmist's prayer and request in the detail in this part. But let's move on. The next grouping you'll see in your Bible is this group, is these verses 19 and 20. And here we find this element that's common in all laments. We see at least the first part of it. It's a turn to praise. So let's read that. So straight out of his prayers of request, he turns to praise and he says, "How abundant are the good things that you have stored up for those who fear you, that you bestow in the sight of on those who take refuge in you. In the shelter of your presence you hide them from all human intrigues. You keep them safe in your dwelling from accusing tongues." Here the psalmist begins his praises by reflecting on the idea of refuge that I discussed earlier from Psalm 2. This blessing from taking refuge. You see that expressed slightly differently here. So the language we see here is the blessing is an abundance of good things. That's how it's being described here. And note also the other echo from Psalm 2, this Psalm 2 concept of blessing in refuge. We see the words there, stored up for those who fear you. So this concept of fearing. The blessing is linked to that fear of understanding the consequences of the opposite of the blessing. So you get here a sense, I think, again, that the psalmist is honing in on God and who he is and what he can do. He's claiming God's absolute certainty, absolute impenetrability of the Lord's refuge. That's where he starts. And then it moves on to verses 21 and 22, and we're still in praise here. So it opens. "Praise be to the Lord, for he showed me the wonders of his love when I was in a city under siege. In my alarm I said, I'm cut off from your sight. Yet you heard my cry for mercy when I called to you for help." And here we see the praise is more coming from his experience. He was in a situation, and he actually feared that God had deserted him, but God heard his cry. And so from that experience, he's bolstered to know that God does hear my cry, and he does come and he saves me. Okay. So he gets a sense here and I think we also get a sense here, as I mentioned before, that he doesn't take the immediate salvation, the immediate refuge for granted. So the psalmist, in a way, is getting a theme going here. I have certainty in you as my refuge, and whether you provide a refuge in my immediate circumstances, well, yeah, that's at your will. And that's different. Those two things are different. That's what I think we're starting to see here. And like that, despite this being quite a long psalm, we're more or less at the end now. So we only have 2 verses left, verses 23 and 24. And helpfully, the psalmist uses those as a call to action. And I think that, and we can use that as a way to sum up. And I don't know if you've caught it through the passage. I'm guessing you haven't from my speaking, but if you look at it closely, there's something that's been going on here a little bit in the passages, that the psalmist seems to have split everything, or not everything, but quite a few of the sections into two. The prayer into 2 parts, the praise into 2 parts. Well, at least the NIV's helped me see that this is how he split it up. And it's always this reflection on God for who he is and his absolute sovereignty, and the reflection on God for what he's done in my life, so that I can look back and that I can see. And in that vein, as we come to the concluding remarks, look for that, because I think that's exactly what he's doing also in the call for action. So let's read from verse 23. Love the Lord, all his faithful people. The Lord preserves those who are true to him, but the proud he pays back in full. So, and then, be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord. So, sorry, I stopped there because they're sort of, the 2 parts are broken into those 2 verses. So the first call to action then is verse 23. Love the Lord, all his faithful people. Why? Because the Lord preserves those who are true to him. Sounds a lot like blessed are those who take refuge in the Lord to me, from Psalm 2. The next verse, I think, highlights the connection even more when it says, in contrast to preserving those who are true to him, the proud he pays back in full. So we get this echo here of kiss the Son or he'll be angry, and your way will lead to destruction. So the first call to action from the psalmist, the first thing that we can take away from this psalm, even this many thousand years beyond this psalm's being penned, is we can take refuge in him. So the first thing we take away is our eternal position before God, our taking refuge in him from an eternal position. We can either take refuge in him and be blessed, or we can ignore him. We can take refuge in ourselves. That is, we can be proud and we can be destroyed. So the gospel is here in the Psalms. There's only 2 ways to live. So then let's move to the second call to action. So one is sort of eternal. The second one is in verse 24. And following the flow, it's more about our immediate needs, our immediate concerns, our present fears. The things that keep us up at night, the things in our day-to-day lives that can eat us up from the inside, impacting our health and our mental state and our relationships. And the psalmist's advice here is, okay, it's quite brief. He says, be strong and take heart. Why? Because your hope is in the Lord. And we might say, well, that's a little bit brief and that's a little bit simplistic. But let's recap quickly. What has the psalmist told us our hope in the Lord is based on? Let's quickly run through the psalm again one more time. I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to run through the key points of why we can have hope in him. So we see in verse 3, the Lord is our rock and fortress. He's faithful in verse 5. He knows us and our afflictions and our anguish, he tells us in verse 7. He's already been busy in our lives, if we look back, and we see where he's delivered us, verse 8. The Lord is sovereign. He knows our times, verse 15. He loves us, verse 16. He's abundant with the good things for us if we fear him, verse 19. He's our shelter, verse 20. And he hears our cries for mercy when we call to him, verse 22. So we see there's plenty for us to take heart from, because our hope in the Lord is strong. Our faithful God is our refuge and our hope now and forever. Let's pray. In you, Lord, let us take refuge. Let us never be put to shame, but deliver us in your righteousness. We thank you for the reminder today that as we face challenges in our lives each day, which at times can seem overwhelming, you're there to hear our cries. And you love us and you have a plan for us that we can trust in. But even more, we acknowledge you, Lord, for who you are, the God of this universe and beyond, a God with whom we deserve no relationship. But still you've reached out to us in love and you've saved us through the work of your Son, Jesus. We thank you for your love demonstrated for us in Jesus. We thank you for this refuge that you've provided us. And we seek refuge in your love and your undeserved blessings it bestows on us, the undeserved blessings it gives us. In your name, amen.